You have been taught to believe that your exhaustion is a personal failure, that your poverty is a moral flaw, that your anxiety is the price of living in a complex world. You have been told that if you work harder, sacrifice more, endure longer, the system will eventually reward you. But what if the opposite is true? What if your suffering is not a malfunction of the system, but its fuel? What if misery is not an accident of capitalism, but its most reliable product? Look closely at the society you inhabit. Wealth piles up at one pole with obscene speed, while deprivation accumulates just as relentlessly at the other. This is not coincidence. This is not the result of fate, incompetence, or human nature. It is the direct consequence of an economic order built upon exploitation, an order in which the many labor so that the few may live without labor, an order that converts human life itself into a commodity to be bought cheaply and consumed completely. Capital does not ask whether you are fulfilled. It asks whether you are profitable. It does not care if your body breaks or your spirit withers so long as production continues and surplus value is extracted. The worker enters the factory, the office, the warehouse, not as a free human being, but as a living appendage of capital, valued only for the labor power they can sell. And even that labor power is paid less than the value it creates, because exploitation is not a moral failing of capital, it is its law of motion. You work longer hours, yet feel poorer. Productivity rises, yet your life shrinks. Technology advances, yet insecurity deepens. Why? Because the fruits of social labor are privately appropriated, because the means of production, the land, the machines, the infrastructure created by generations of workers are owned by a minority whose wealth grows precisely because yours does not. The more you produce, the more powerful capital becomes over you. The richer society becomes, the poorer the worker feels within it. Alienation is not a psychological condition, it is a social one. You are alienated from the product of your labor, which confronts you as something foreign and hostile. You are alienated from the act of labor itself, which becomes a forced activity rather than an expression of life. You are alienated from your fellow workers, turned into competitors instead of comrades. And finally, you are alienated from your own human potential, reduced to survival when you were meant for creation. The ruling class tells you this is freedom. They point to the market and call it choice, though you must sell your labor or starve. They praise competition, though it isolates you and fractures collective power. They glorify success stories to obscure the millions whose labor made those successes possible. Ideology becomes their most efficient weapon. It convinces the exploited to defend the very system that exploits them. But history does not stand still. Every mode of production carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. Capitalism, by concentrating workers in vast enterprises and uniting them through shared conditions of exploitation, produces not only commodities but a class capable of overthrowing it. The proletariat is not merely a victim of history, it is its engine of transformation. Do not believe the lie that you are powerless. Your labor is the source of all value. Without you, not a wheel turns, not a light shines, not a profit is made. The power of capital appears immense only because it is concentrated. The power of labor is greater because it is collective. When workers recognize themselves as a class, when they organize not as isolated individuals, but as a united force, the foundations of exploitation begin to crack. Reform alone cannot liberate you, because exploitation is not an error that can be corrected. It is the basis of the system itself. As long as production exists for profit rather than human need, suffering will remain profitable. True emancipation requires a transformation of social relations, the abolition of private ownership of the means of production, and the reclamation of collective control over the conditions of life. This is not a call to chaos, but to consciousness, not to blind rage, but to organized struggle. The task before you is immense, but it is also necessary. You have nothing to lose but the chains that bind your labor, your time, your dignity. You have a world to gain, one in which human beings are ends in themselves, not instruments of profit. Your suffering is profitable under this system. That is why it persists, and that is precisely why it must end. Under capitalism, suffering is not a random occurrence or the result of personal failure. It is a structural inevitability embedded in the very organization of economic life. The system is designed to extract surplus value from human labor, to convert the energies, creativity, and time of workers into profit for a class that owns the means of production. From the moment a worker enters the workforce, their life is subordinated to the logic of capital. Work is no longer an expression of human potential or a means of fulfilling needs. It becomes a mechanism for producing value that is expropriated by someone else. Every hour of labor, every ounce of skill, every effort to innovate or improve productivity contributes to wealth that is systematically withheld from the producer. The disparity between what workers create and what they receive is not incidental, it is the defining feature of the economic order. This extraction of surplus is rationalized and normalized through wages, which are presented as fair compensation, while concealing the reality that the value of labor is always greater than the reward offered. The worker is paid only enough to survive and reproduce their capacity to labor, ensuring that they remain tethered to the system that exploits them, and that their suffering continues unabated. Capitalism is inherently unequal because it requires the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few to function. The accumulation of capital is dependent on keeping the majority in a state of dependence and precarity. Poverty is therefore not a misfortune to be remedied with charity or individual effort. It is a necessary condition for the enrichment of capitalists. The more desperate and insecure workers are, the more pliable and exploitable they become. This structural suffering is enforced through mechanisms that appear natural or inevitable: the labor market, competition, and the commodification of basic human needs such as housing, healthcare, and education. These institutions do not exist to serve human welfare, but to reproduce the conditions of exploitation. When a worker struggles to afford basic necessities, this struggle is a direct result of the systemic extraction of value from their labor. The working class is compelled to labor under increasingly harsh conditions, not because of laziness or incapacity, but because the survival of the capitalist system depends on their continued subjugation. Moreover, suffering under capitalism is amplified by the illusion of meritocracy and individual responsibility. Workers are taught to internalize failure, to blame themselves for poverty or hardship, while the structural forces that shape their lives remain invisible. The system promotes the idea that if one works harder, one can escape deprivation, masking the reality that labor exploitation is not a function of effort, but of ownership and control. Even when productivity rises and technological advancements occur, these benefits are rarely shared equitably. Automation, efficiency, and innovation often increase profits for owners, while displacing workers, intensifying insecurity, and eroding stability. The constant drive for profit ensures that suffering is not an aberration but a persistent feature of social life. The social consequences of this structural suffering are profound. Workers are alienated not only from the products of their labor but also from themselves and from one another. Communities are fractured as competition for jobs, wages, and survival takes precedence over solidarity. Families endure long working hours, chronic stress, and inadequate access to health and leisure, producing a cycle of deprivation that spans generations. Children inherit the consequences of adult labor exploitation, entering a world where opportunities are constrained by the distribution of wealth and resources that favors the ruling class. Education instead of being a liberatory force, is often a mechanism for preparing the next generation of laborers to fit into a system that will exploit them in similar ways. Every aspect of social life is permeated by the logic of production for profit rather than for human need, making suffering not only widespread but structurally embedded. Capitalism also produces psychological suffering by measuring human worth in terms of economic output. Workers are valued not as people but as instruments of production, judged by efficiency, productivity, and compliance. The continual pressure to perform and compete generates anxiety, depression, and a pervasive sense of inadequacy, which are not individual pathologies but social products of an exploitative system. Leisure, rest, and creative expression are subordinated to the demands of labor, leaving individuals trapped in cycles of exhaustion and deprivation. Even attempts at resistance are constrained by structural forces, unions are undermined, collective action criminalized, and social policies designed to pacify rather than empower. Suffering is therefore both material and psychological, sustained by a system whose primary objective is the accumulation of capital. In this sense, suffering under capitalism is predictable and intentional. It is the byproduct of a system that requires inequality, precarity, and alienation to reproduce itself. Every structural arrangement, from wages and working hours to property laws and market dynamics, is calibrated to extract the maximum benefit from human labor, while minimizing the capacity for autonomy and well-being. The capitalist mode of production ensures that those who create value remain in a state of deprivation relative to those who appropriate it, making suffering not incidental, but a necessary condition of the social order. This suffering is systemic, intergenerational, and comprehensive, shaping every aspect of life. It will continue to persist as long as the structural conditions of capitalism remain unchallenged. Profit under capitalism is not a reward for ingenuity, efficiency, or risk-taking alone. It is fundamentally the product of exploitation, rooted in the extraction of surplus value from the labor of workers. The worker produces more value through their labor than the wage they receive in exchange, and this excess, the surplus value, is appropriated by the owner of the means of production. This is not a marginal or incidental feature of the economic system. It is the very mechanism through which wealth is concentrated and capital accumulates. Every commodity sold carries within it a hidden transfer, the labor invested in its creation, measured in time, effort, and skill, far exceeds the compensation provided to the laborer, creating a gap that becomes the source of profit for capitalists. The process is systematic and necessary for the reproduction of capitalist society. Without this extraction, there could be no accumulation, no expansion, and no guarantee of continued dominance by the owning class. It is this relationship between labor and capital that defines the social order and structures inequality. The extraction of surplus value occurs in multiple forms, both overt and subtle. In the simplest sense, the capitalist purchases labor power at a wage sufficient to reproduce the worker's capacity to labor. The worker may labor for 8, 10, or 12 hours a day, yet the value they produce during that time exceeds what is required to cover their subsistence. The difference, the surplus, is expropriated by the capitalist, whose wealth grows without corresponding effort. This basic dynamic underpins the capitalist economy and explains why accumulation is always dependent on the continued subordination of labor. It is not merely that some workers are underpaid or exploited by unscrupulous bosses. The system itself is designed to ensure that all labor produces more than it receives. Surplus value is embedded in the very logic of production, and profit is inseparable from exploitation. The generation of surplus value also shapes every aspect of working life. Time becomes a unit of calculation, and labor is quantified, monitored, and optimized to extract the maximum possible value. The more the worker produces beyond what is necessary for their subsistence, the more profit accrues to the capitalist. This dynamic drives the relentless pursuit of efficiency, technological innovation, and intensified labor processes, not for the benefit of society or the fulfillment of human needs, but solely to increase the surplus extracted from the workforce. Workers are compelled to work harder, faster, and longer, yet the fruits of their productivity do not enrich them. They enrich those who already control the conditions of production. Productivity gains, far from liberating workers, are systematically captured and converted into profit. Capitalists also rely on structural mechanisms to maintain and expand surplus value. The division of labor reduces workers to specialized tasks, making them easier to control and replace, while increasing the quantity of output each can produce. Technological innovations, instead of reducing the burden of labor for all, are deployed to intensify production and extract more value from fewer workers. Wages are kept low relative to output. Unemployment is maintained to discipline labor, and social institutions often support the maintenance of this system by normalizing inequality and individualizing responsibility. Even social and cultural pressures, competition, consumerism, and status anxieties play a role in ensuring that workers continue to produce surplus that will be appropriated without protest. Every structural and ideological arrangement is oriented toward maintaining the flow of surplus value from labor to capital. Furthermore, surplus value is not a static or local phenomenon. It is the driving force behind global capitalism. Capitalists seek to reduce wages and increase productivity wherever possible, leading to the exploitation of workers across borders, the relocation of production to lower-cost regions, and the intensification of labor in global supply chains. The same principle applies internationally as it does domestically. The value produced by workers exceeds what they receive in compensation, and the excess is captured as profit. The global accumulation of wealth, the concentration of economic power, and the disparity between nations are therefore direct consequences of the extraction of surplus value. Profit is not merely a measure of market success or ingenuity. It is the systematic expropriation of human labor at every level of society. This dynamic also shapes social and political life, as the ruling class relies on the accumulation of surplus value to secure influence, control institutions, and reproduce the conditions of its dominance. The wealth generated through exploitation funds political campaigns, shapes laws, and reinforces social hierarchies. Workers, deprived of the full value of their labor, are left with limited resources to challenge the structures that exploit them. Ideology and culture are deployed to obscure the reality of surplus extraction, presenting profit as a reward for risk, intelligence, or enterprise, rather than as the product of systematically unpaid labor. This misrepresentation ensures that exploitation appears natural and justified, masking the fundamental injustice that underpins the economic system. Thus, profit is inseparable from exploitation. Capital does not generate wealth independently. It does so only by capturing the excess labor of the many. Every expansion of production, every increase in efficiency, and every accumulation of wealth depends on the appropriation of surplus value. This is the foundation of capitalist power, the source of inequality, and the structural mechanism through which the working class is subordinated. The entire economic order, its institutions, its policies, and its culture is oriented toward maximizing the extraction of surplus from labor, ensuring that profit remains both the indicator and the instrument of exploitation, and that the majority of society continues to produce wealth they will never fully enjoy. Under capitalism, alienation is not a psychological accident or an occasional side effect of labor. It is a structural condition imposed by the very organization of production. Human beings are reduced to commodities measured not by their creativity, intellect, or capacity for cooperation, but by their utility as instruments of labor. The worker is separated from the product of their work, which becomes something foreign and hostile, a thing over which they have no control, and from which they derive no true satisfaction. The object they create is sold, consumed, and exchanged, but the worker remains powerless over its destiny. This separation transforms labor from an expression of life into a mechanism for the reproduction of capital. Work is no longer an act of self-realization but a means to survive, and the worker's value is defined entirely in terms of their ability to generate profit for someone else. The reduction of human life to a commodity is therefore not incidental. It is the essential operation of capitalist production, and it permeates every aspect of social existence. The alienation of labor occurs on multiple levels. First, the worker is alienated from the product of their labor. The fruits of their creativity, effort, and skill are appropriated by the capitalist, leaving the worker with only a fraction of the value they produce. They contribute to the creation of wealth, but that wealth is never theirs. It belongs to the owners of production. This creates a fundamental estrangement between the worker and their own activity as the labor. That should be fulfilling and life-affirming becomes a source of depletion and frustration. The more the worker produces, the more wealth is accumulated elsewhere, and the more their own needs remain unmet. Second, workers are alienated from the labor process itself. Work becomes repetitive, fragmented, and dictated by the requirements of efficiency rather than human need or creativity. Tasks are reduced to mechanical motions, stripped of meaning, and controlled by supervisors, machines, and schedules. The laborer does not act freely but is compelled to labor in a manner prescribed by the logic of profit. The worker's energies, attention, and time are appropriated for ends that are not their own, making the act of labor itself an instrument of alienation. Rather than shaping the world to meet human ends, the worker shapes themselves to fit the demands of capital. Third, alienation separates individuals from each other. Capitalism encourages competition rather than cooperation, fragmenting communities and weakening collective bonds. Workers are pitted against one another in the labor market, competing for scarce jobs, promotion, and wages, which undermines solidarity and makes collective resistance difficult. The social relations of production are transformed into relations of exploitation and rivalry, leaving human connections mediated by economic calculation rather than mutual recognition. The worker is isolated not only from the product and process of labor but from the society in which they exist, reduced to a unit of labor to be bought and sold. Fourth, alienation extends to the worker's own humanity. When a person is valued only for their labor, their human potential, creativity, intelligence, empathy, and imagination is subordinated to the imperatives of production. Workers are treated as inputs in a machine rather than as self-determining beings. The measure of human worth becomes purely economic, and the worker is forced to assess their own life through the lens of productivity and profitability. Rest, leisure, and personal fulfillment are commodified or denied, and human life itself is reduced to the capacity to work. Mental and physical exhaustion, stress, and despair are structural consequences of this reduction, not aberration. Alienation is reinforced by the broader social and economic system. Education, media, and culture often serve to naturalize this condition, presenting labor as an inevitable duty and the market as the ultimate arbiter of value. Ideologies of meritocracy and individual responsibility obscure the structural causes of suffering, convincing workers that their exploitation is a result of personal failure rather than systemic dynamics. The illusion of freedom and choice is maintained even as human beings are continually subordinated to the demands of capital. Consumption is promoted as a source of fulfillment, yet the ability to consume depends on participation in the labor system that alienates the individual in the first place. Technology and mechanization, while often portrayed as liberatory, frequently intensify alienation. Machines and automation increase productivity, but they also de-skill labor, standardize tasks, and further separate workers from the creative and decision-making aspects of production. The worker becomes a mere appendage to the machine, their value measured solely by output, speed, and compliance. The process of human labor is subordinated entirely to the logic of capital, and human beings are transformed into commodities whose usefulness is determined by their capacity to generate surplus value. This reduction of human life to a commodity has profound social, psychological, and political consequences. Individuals experience a persistent sense of estrangement from their own activity, their communities, and their potential. Human relationships are mediated by economic calculation. Creativity is suppressed, and life itself is subordinated to production. Alienation under capitalism is therefore both systemic and totalizing, shaping the conditions of existence for the working class and reproducing a society in which the value of human beings is defined solely by their economic utility, leaving vast potential for human flourishing unfulfilled. Under capitalism, ideology functions as a powerful mechanism for sustaining class domination and masking the realities of exploitation. It is not merely a set of ideas or beliefs held by individuals, but a systematic structure embedded in institutions, culture, education, and media that shapes the way people perceive the world, their place within it, and their relationship to power. Ideology presents social arrangements as natural, inevitable, or just, obscuring the underlying economic relations that produce inequality. It teaches the oppressed to accept their position as normal or deserved, to internalize their suffering, and to identify with the interests of those who dominate them. Through this process, inequality is not only maintained but actively reproduced, as the working class is persuaded to consent to conditions that systematically benefit the ruling class, while undermining their own collective power. One of the central ways ideology operates is by framing the economic system as a meritocracy. Individuals are told that wealth and success result from talent, hard work, and intelligence, while poverty and deprivation are the consequences of laziness, incompetence, or poor choices. This narrative conceals the structural realities of exploitation, where wealth is accumulated through the extraction of surplus value from the labor of others. By presenting inequality as the outcome of individual effort rather than social organization, ideology shifts attention away from systemic causes and fosters a sense of personal failure among the oppressed. Workers are encouraged to compete with one another, to see each other as rivals rather than allies, and to focus on individual advancement rather than collective struggle. This competition reinforces class hierarchies and prevents the formation of solidarity necessary for challenging exploitation. Education serves as another instrument of ideological control. Schools often claim to provide equal opportunity, yet they reproduce social hierarchies by preparing children to occupy predetermined roles in the labor market. The curriculum emphasizes compliance, discipline, and conformity, instilling the belief that authority and hierarchy are natural and beneficial. Critical thinking that might expose structural injustices is frequently marginalized, while technical skills are emphasized to serve the demands of production and profit. Students internalize the idea that success within the system is a personal achievement rather than a reflection of access, privilege, and inherited social advantages. In this way, education contributes to the normalization of inequality, shaping generations to accept a domination as a legitimate aspect of social life. Media and culture are equally instrumental in perpetuating ideology. News outlets, entertainment, and advertising present capitalist norms as universal truths, glorify consumption, individualism, and the accumulation of wealth while downplaying structural exploitation. Success stories of extraordinary individuals are celebrated as models for all. Create the illusion that anyone can achieve similar outcomes if they try hard enough. Meanwhile, the systemic deprivation experienced by the majority is ignored, minimized, or blamed on personal shortcomings. Cultural narratives frame obedience, competition, and the prioritization of profit over collective well-being as virtuous, embedding the logic of capitalism into everyday consciousness. Through repetition and normalization, these ideas shape perceptions of what is possible, acceptable, and desirable, reinforcing the legitimacy of the social order. Ideology also functions to depoliticize suffering. Social inequalities, poverty, and insecurity are often framed as technical problems, moral failings, or inevitable outcomes of a complex economy. This framing discourages critical examination of systemic causes and undermines the possibility of organized resistance. Social policies and welfare programs are presented as benevolent concessions rather than response to structural exploitation, creating the illusion that the system is just and responsive by offering limited relief while leaving the underlying relations of production intact. Ideology pacifies discontent and channels dissatisfaction into avenues that do not threaten the dominant order. Religion and moral discourse frequently reinforce these patterns by promoting obedience, patience, and the promise of reward in an afterlife, further legitimizing earthly inequalities. Ethical codes and social norms are constructed to maintain hierarchy, valorize compliance, and stigmatize dissent. Workers are encouraged to accept suffering as virtuous or necessary to endure deprivation silently, and to view protest or rebellion as morally suspect. In this way, ideology operates not only in the material sphere but also within consciousness, shaping desires, beliefs, and moral judgments in ways that sustain domination. The result of this pervasive ideological apparatus is a society in which inequality appears natural, inevitable, and morally justified. Workers consent to their own exploitation, internalize failure, and compete with one another, weakening collective capacity for resistance. Structural inequalities are obscured. Systemic injustice is normalized, and the power of the ruling class is reinforced. Ideology functions as a lens through which social reality is interpreted, transforming conditions of oppression into seemingly immutable truths, and ensuring that domination continues without the need for constant overt coercion. Through these mechanisms, ideology masks class domination and maintains the illusion that the existing social order is legitimate, moral, and necessary. By shaping perception, belief, and desire, it secures the consent of the oppressed, enabling inequality to persist across generations while preventing recognition of the systemic forces that produce and sustain it. This normalization of exploitation ensures that social hierarchies remain intact, that surplus labor continues to be appropriated by the ruling class, and that the working majority remains blind to the collective power they hold and the possibility of radical transformation. The path to liberation under capitalism lies not in isolated acts of resistance, nor in fleeting reforms, but in the development of collective class consciousness. This consciousness arises when workers recognize themselves not as fragmented individuals struggling alone against hardship, but as members of a unified class whose shared exploitation forms the basis of social and economic relations. To see oneself as a worker is to see one's labor as the source of all value, to understand that the wealth enjoyed by a minority is produced through the unpaid or underpaid labor of the majority, and to perceive that this condition is neither natural nor inevitable. but historically produced and maintained by specific social arrangements. Collective awareness of this reality is essential because liberation is impossible without an understanding of the structural forces that bind labor to capital, and without a recognition that the power of the ruling class depends entirely on the division, isolation, and alienation of the working majority. Class consciousness transforms the perception of suffering from individual misfortune into a shared experience of exploitation. When workers perceive that their hardship is a product of systemic oppression rather than personal failure, resentment and despair are transformed into political awareness and potential action. The recognition of shared conditions allows workers to identify the mechanisms of control and exploitation, the extraction of surplus value, alienation from the product of labor, unequal access to resources, and the ideological apparatus that justifies inequality. Understanding these mechanisms demystifies the social order and strips the ruling class of the moral authority that sustains it. The worker no longer sees the existing hierarchy as natural or deserved, but as an artificial structure maintained by power, ideology, and violence when necessary, which can be challenged collectively. Collective class consciousness also entails the rejection of competition and individualism, which are central tools used by capital to divide workers. Capitalism fosters rivalry among laborers by pitting them against one another for wages, promotion, and opportunities, ensuring that potential collective power remains fragmented. When workers develop awareness of their shared exploitation, they begin to see their fellows not as competitors but as comrades whose interests align with their own. Solidarity becomes the foundation for organized struggle, enabling workers to pool resources, coordinate action, and amplify their bargaining power. Strikes, unionization, political mobilization, and cooperative institutions are practical manifestations of this consciousness, translating awareness into action. In the absence of solidarity, individual grievances remain powerless to challenge systemic structures, but united action can directly confront the mechanisms of exploitation. Historical examples show that collective consciousness is often forged through struggle itself. When workers organize against injustice, they experience firsthand the strength inherent in unity and the weaknesses of a divided class. Struggles over wages, working conditions, or political rights are not merely economic or legal battles. They are the crucibles in which understanding of systemic oppression and the potential for transformation are forged. Through confrontation with the ruling class, workers learn their collective strength, develop strategies for sustained resistance, and cultivate the belief that social structures can be changed. Education, discussion, and political engagement further deepen this awareness, allowing workers to link immediate struggles to broader systemic realities and long-term goals of emancipation. Collective class consciousness also illuminates the historical dimension of oppression. Workers come to understand that capitalism, like all social orders, is historically contingent. It emerged under particular conditions, and it can therefore be dismantled or transformed under new conditions. The recognition that the system is a human creation rather than a natural inevitability empowers workers to imagine alternatives. They begin to see that human labor and cooperation can be organized not for profit but for human need, and that social institutions can be restructured to prioritize well-being, equality, and freedom. This historical perspective prevents resignation to present conditions and provides the ideological foundation for revolutionary thought and action. Furthermore, collective class consciousness is inseparable from political organization. Awareness of shared exploitation must be expressed through structures that can mobilize power, resist domination, and ultimately transform social relations. Political parties, labor unions, cooperatives, and grassroots movements provide vehicles through which consciousness becomes strategy, and strategy becomes material change. Consciousness without organization remains abstract. An organization without consciousness can reproduce oppression within the movement itself. The fusion of insight and coordinated action ensures that struggles are purposeful, directed, and capable of challenging the entrenched interests of the ruling class. Ultimately, collective class consciousness is the foundation for the abolition of exploitation and the establishment of a society in which human labor serves human needs rather than the accumulation of profit. It transforms alienation into solidarity, competition into cooperation, and passive suffering into active struggle. It enables the working majority to recognize the full scope of their own power, both as producers of all wealth and as the determinant force capable of reshaping society. By fostering awareness, solidarity, and organization, collective consciousness becomes both the path and the engine of liberation, providing the insight, motivation, and cohesion necessary to overthrow the structural inequalities imposed by capitalism and to construct a world where human life is valued above profit, and the fruits of labor belong to those who create them. The reality of our society is stark. Your suffering is not accidental. Your labor is exploited. Your life is commodified. And inequality is maintained through ideology. Capitalism does not merely tolerate hardship, it depends on it, extracting surplus value from your work while alienating you from the products, the process, and even your own humanity. It teaches you to accept deprivation, to compete with your peers, and to see the social order as natural. But these conditions are neither inevitable nor permanent. The power of the ruling class rests on the division and ignorance of the working majority. Only by recognizing the systemic roots of exploitation, by cultivating collective class consciousness, and by organizing in solidarity can this power be challenged. Liberation is possible because the majority holds the true source of wealth and production. When workers unite, understand their shared exploitation, and act collectively, they possess the capacity to reclaim what has been taken, to reshape society, and to create a world where human life, creativity, and dignity are valued above profit. The suffering that has been made profitable can be transformed into the force that achieves freedom.